Okay, so this lecture is on memory. When we talk about a memory, we're talking about our ability to understand and use language, recognize faces and facial expression, recognize colors. We use our memory to have common sense about how the world works, to remember the alphabet, all kinds of things. So, um, in this lecture, I'm going to cover what psychology knows about memory and just give you some general principles about how memory works. So this is broken up into two parts. The first part is on basic memory processes, including encoding, storage, and retrieval. And then the second part, I'll talk about eyewitness testimony and the important applications for understanding how our memory works for the criminal justice system. So the overview of part one, first I'm going to review types of memory, including working, semantic, and episodic. And then we'll also focus on stages of memory, that is how our memory works, including the three processes of encoding, storage, and retrieval. By the end of this lecture, you should know definitions and the differences between working memory, episodic memory, and semantic memory. You should also be able to describe the three stages in the process of learning and remembering, which are encoding, storage, and retrieval. Describe some strategies that can be used to enhance encoding of information as well as retrieval. All right, so let's start with types of memory. Our working memory is defined as the ability to hold information in our mind for a brief period of time and work with it. So this would also include our ability to recall the details of our immediate environment. A synonym for working memory is also short-term memory. It's the idea that we're just for the short term working with information in our brain. So we use our working memory all the time in our everyday lives. So just think about if you're asked to do some math in your head, like add up some numbers, or you're walking through the store and you're kind of keeping a running count of all the things that you need to get off your shopping list, as well as maybe how much you spent so far. Even doing something like telling a story to your friends, you've got to hold some information in your brain and to be able to describe the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. And you need to remember what you've said and then build on that. So really any time that we are working with information that is currently in our mind, we're referring to we're using our working memory. That's different than our semantic memory. So the next type we'll learn about is our semantic memory. And you can think of your semantic memory as your storehouse of permanent knowledge. Okay, so storehouse or warehouse. It's all the things that you have in your brain. So this would include facts and general knowledge, vocabulary, understanding of cultural norms. If you're a person that likes history, you'll know and remember the names and dates, names of famous historical figures or the dates of events. If you're really into sports, you might be able to tell me who played in the Super Bowl for the last 10 years. Because you're college students, your heads are filled up with all kinds of useful information and facts. Just in this class, for example, if you remember what Piaget's theory consisted of, the four distinct stages, starting with sensory motor and then ending with formal operational. If you've remembered that it's our prefrontal cortex that is associated with planning and problem solving. This is all semantic knowledge. This is your permanent knowledge. It's the stuff that you know. If you're really good at trivia, you've got a lot of semantic knowledge, a lot of facts in your brain. It's all the vocabulary that we know. So if you have an extensive vocabulary, if you know multiple languages, this is your semantic memory. And then finally, it's our understanding of cultural norms. So our knowledge of appropriate behaviors or rules of conduct in different situations, like what we do at a restaurant or what we do at school, that in certain cultures we shake hands, in certain cultures we bow. So all of these things constitute our semantic memory. All right, and then third and final type is our episodic memory. Our episodic memory is our ability to remember the episodes of our life. So episodic memory is often what we think about when we hear the word memory. It's our ability to recall details from our life experiences, and in doing so, establish a sense of identity. Our autobiographical memory refers to remembering specific events that have happened over the course of our life. So, for example, you might remember your first day of kindergarten. You might remember your favorite birthday present that you got when you were younger. And then sometimes, if we've got older relatives, people that we say that they're losing their memory, perhaps due to Alzheimer's disease, the type of memory that we're referring to is episodic memory. That they're just they are losing their ability to remember their experiences. In contrast, even among people that have Alzheimer's disease, they still have their semantic memory. So they still know facts and information. They just might not, with Alzheimer's, remember the episodes of their life. Okay. All right. So let's talk about now the stages of memory. So our first stage is encoding. And this refers to the initial experience of perceiving and learning events. Okay, so we're basically taking in sensory information from the environment. And there's a couple things to know about the encoding process. The first thing is that it's automatically. Encoding occurs during our initial exposure to information and happens automatically. This doesn't mean that everything we experience is necessarily encoded or retained for the long term. So, for example, very routine occurrences don't make as strong of an impression as unique occurrences. So, we just simply don't hold on to and remember all the routine, trivial, or mundane experiences of our life. More about this in a little bit. The basic idea is that our brains are making rapid fire calculations about the relative importance of information coming in, and we hold on to certain things and we discard others. The second principle is that encoding is selective. We pay attention to some events in our environment and we ignore others. If something happens that seems strange, for example, think about the last time that you were on campus. If you notice something out of the ordinary, something unusual, it's likely that you remember it because it was atypical. Our brains are very good at being selective about strange or unusual information and holding on to that. Okay, so on a typical day, you might park in the parking lot, walk to your first class, and if things are just typical or not unusual, it'd be very difficult to remember what your walk was like on any particular day, last week or the week before. But if something very strange happened, okay, you saw somebody dressed up in a costume walking across campus, or you saw somebody fall down and get hurt, or you saw something that you just weren't expecting to see, that memory would stand out in your brain as something unusual, and you would remember that day. So this really refers to the principle of distinctiveness. And distinctiveness really aids in the encoding process. Distinctiveness is the principle that unusual events are more likely to be recalled and recognized than commonplace or non-distinct events. And indeed, psychologists have come up with the phrase flashbulb memory as a way to describe moments that when people receive significant news that becomes etched in their memory with great clarity. So the name comes from taking a picture and thinking about a flash going off, and it's a snapshot in time that people can remember with great clarity. It's especially vivid. So you can take a moment and maybe think back in your own life whether there's a particular memory that really stands out, is especially clear and vivid compared to other memories. Perhaps you can recall very specific details. Do you remember what you were doing at the time, what you were wearing, what was the room or space that you were in, and what did it look like? Do you remember what you were doing that day before you found out this news? One event from my own life was how I learned about the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I remember that I was living in Denver at the time. I had gotten up in the morning to go to work, turned on the news and was making breakfast, and I saw an image on the news of a plane flying into the Twin Towers. I remember thinking immediately, I hope my friends that live in Manhattan are all right. I went to work, and I remember telling my coworker the news. She had gotten into work early and she hadn't heard. And I remember telling her, and she immediately broke down and started crying. But I remember all the details. I remember what that office looked like. I remember what my desk looked like. That is an example of a memory that is especially vivid for me. I can't tell you hardly any other days of that I worked, but I remember that day. So that's an example of a flashbulb memory. All right. So the next process that we're going to talk about is recoding. The process of encoding involves recoding, which is taking information from the form that it's delivered to us in and then converting it in a way that we can make sense out of it. So recoding is our memory's way of making associations between new information and things we already know. These associations then become a framework for our ability to retrieve that information. Recoding can be a deliberate act to help us improve retention. And one way we do this is to use strategies or tricks for remembering information that are called mnemonic devices. One mnemonic device that you might be familiar with, even though you might not know the name mnemonic device, is the acronym PEMDAS, for Please Excuse My Dear Aunt Sally. Many of you might have learned this in a math class earlier as a way to remember the order of operations in a mathematical equation. So PEMDAS stands for parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. Okay, and that tells us how to, the order in which the operation should be performed in a mathematical equation. It's much easier to remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. That's very easy for us to remember. So if we can remember the starts with P, please, we know that will stand for parentheses. The excuse stands for exponents. So this is an example of intentional recoding, creating a mnemonic device to help us as we're encoding, storing that information. Another example that we have from psychology is the OCEAN acronym. Now, OCEAN is a way to remember the big 5 dimensions of personality, something that we'll learn about later in the class. O stands for openness, C stands for conscientiousness, E extroversion, A agreeableness, and N neuroticism. So if you can remember the acronym OCEAN, that will help you remember the Big Five. Now, forming associations and making inferences can happen without our awareness. And this is one reason why people sometimes remember false events or misremember things. So even though the recoding process can be valuable for helping us remember information, it can also be an example of misremembering information. Let's try to do an example here, see if it works. What I'm going to do is read a list of words. I just want you to listen to these words, and then I will present a list of words, and your job is just to tell me whether you heard me say the word on the list. Okay, so here we go. The first word is airplane, airport, runway, travel, destination, ticket, agent, kiosk, counter, passenger, seat, beverage, delay, on time. All right, so the next thing that I'm going to do is present a list of words, and your job is to recognize whether that word was on the list. Here's the first one. Which of the following words were on the list? Was that on the list? What about that one? That word? What about that word? That word? That word? Or that word? Okay, so what'd you think? If you said that airplane was on the list, you're correct. If you said that runway was on the list, you're also correct. If you said that baseball was not on the list, you'd be correct. If you said that pilot was on the list, you'd be incorrect. That pilot was not on the list. And then the other words were, of course, not on the list. Okay. Now, when researchers do this task, what they find is that many people falsely recognize pilot, and your module gives an example of another example of this, and where people falsely recognize certain words as being on the list to the extent that it fits the category. This is known as the DRM phenomenon, or the Diess-Rodiger-McDermott effect. One explanation is that while we listen to the words on the list, the words trigger you to think about a pilot even though a pilot was never presented. This is because during the recoding process, we form associations between memories, and this can happen without our awareness. Indeed, all of the words on the list had to do with air travel, and pilots are a part of air travel. Okay, so when we're bringing in that information, we're trying to encode it, our brains will do a recoding process of forming associations. And sometimes that's beneficial, and we can use it to our advantage, as when we talk about memory mnemonics and mnemonic devices, but sometimes we make mistakes. And this is an example of how we can have false memories. So again, this is called the DRM, or the Diess-Rodiger-McDermott effect. Okay. Another way that recoding can lead to false memories is through a process called making pragmatic inferences. This is where we make false memories based on what we think is likely or logical. And we remember the inferences, that is our guesses, as if they were actual experiences. In a study by Brewer, participants were more likely to misremember the sentence, "The karate champion hit the cinder block," as "the karate champion broke the cinder block." Why? Because breaking the cinder block is a pragmatic inference. If a karate champion is indeed a champion, they should be able to break through a cinder block. So it's more likely to misremember the sentence as involving the verb broke instead of hit. As another example, let's just say we have we can make inferences about why our friends tell us that they don't want to go out. So we might misremember that our friend told us that she didn't want to go out because she didn't have any money, even though she never said that. She just said she didn't want to go out. We filled in the reason why our friend didn't want to go out with us because it's reasonable or logical. In other words, we make a pragmatic inference and misremember what was truly said. So that's a second example of where recoding goes wrong. All right, so that was all about the encoding process. Let's move to storage. So cognitive psychologists refer to a memory trace as a change in the nervous system that represents our experience. We've learned that our neurons work using an electrical chemical process, and that our brain tissue can biochemically alter itself. Think about it just like writing a note. Our brain writes a memory trace and it alters its own composition to do so. We won't go real deep into the biology of this, but for the purposes of this lecture, it suffices to say that a change in our nervous system that represents our experience is called a memory trace. There's also a process called consolidation. So the neural changes that occur over time to create the memory trace of an experience is referred to consolidation. Events in our lives create memory traces through a process of consolidation. And what this means is that anytime we try to remember an event, we rely not only on the details of the event itself, but on the associations involved in the encoding process. The memory trace is created by all of the elements together. So the idea here is that we don't just remember a single memory. We remember everything that is associated with that memory. So our memory works via associations, and our mind has been described as an associative network. So in trying to remember a single memory, it can be virtually impossible not to remember other things that are associated with that memory. That's because of consolidation, that we form associations not just with a single event, with a single memory trace, but everything that is associated with that trace. Okay. So I think everybody appreciates that, unfortunately, our memory can be unreliable. And much of our ability to be accurate depends on something called the retention interval, which is the time between learning something and then being tested on it, or between encoding a piece of information and then being asked to retrieve it. In general, the shorter the interval, the easier it is to remember that information. For instance, if I asked you what you had for lunch yesterday, you could probably tell me, because that's a short retention interval. You might need to think about it, but you probably could. However, if I asked you to remember what you had for lunch last week, it would be much more difficult, unless you eat the same thing for lunch every day. So the important thing to know about the retention interval is this is when memory is highly vulnerable to errors. One way a memory error can occur is through a process called retroactive interference. This occurs when activities within the retention interval interfere with the memory. So if asked to remember what you had for lunch 2 weeks ago, all the lunches that you've had since then created retroactive interference. In other words, there's new activities and new information that are getting in the way of retrieving an older specific memory. The reason it's easier to remember what you had for lunch yesterday is because there's less information or activities getting in the way. It's a shorter interval. One type of retroactive interference is called the misinformation effect. This is the phenomenon whereby the memory for an event can be changed via misinformation supplied during the retention interval. This is an important phenomenon to know when it comes to eyewitness testimony, and something I'll talk about a bit more later in the lecture. But for example, if you witnessed a crime and then subsequently heard people describing it from their own perspective, this new information would interfere or disrupt your own personal recollection of the crime. In fact, you may even remember the event happening as the way other people described it versus how you saw it. Okay, so we'll learn more about this, but the specific version of retroactive interference is the misinformation effect that happens with eyewitness testimony. Now, proactive interference occurs when activities before the retention interval interfere with the memory. So here, activities, experiences, or prior knowledge interfere with encoding new memories. For example, if you've ever studied a second language, oftentimes the grammar rules and the vocabulary of your native language will pop into your head and will impair your fluency or ability to speak the second language. Proactive interference is also very common when learning a new sport. In fact, if you've ever practiced a sport and you've worked with a coach, they're often very critical of bad habits that you learned early on in practicing the sport. Those bad habits, in other words, the first way you learned how to either swing a tennis racket or swing a golf club, maybe throw a kick in martial arts, or how you learn to skate, all of those bad habits that you learn can get in the way and interfere with you learning how to perform the activity correctly. That's another example of proactive interference. All right, finally, let's talk about retrieval. Retrieval, let me take that away for a second. Retrieval is where we call forth or retrieve all the information from our storehouse of knowledge in order to apply it to what we're doing presently. So we encode thousands of memories every day as memory traces. If you think about all the sights, all the sounds, all the conversations, there's thousands of potential memories that you encode. Most of this information is never retrieved. It's stored away and remains dormant, we could say, kind of asleep. Currently, there's no way of knowing how long these memory traces last. We don't know whether they're dormant forever or whether they disappear over time. It's something that cognitive psychologists don't know. However, much of the information that's not directly retrieved is still useful, and that shapes our knowledge in subtle, unconscious ways. So the metaphor that we've already learned about from our discussion of Freud is the iceberg metaphor, is that the tip of the iceberg refers to what we have in our conscious mind, but his idea is that we have an unconscious mind, is that there's lots of things that get in our brain that we're unaware of, but that have the potential to affect our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And this is a commonly accepted idea in mainstream psychology. All right, so there's a distinction between the information that we encode and store. Okay, so we've got available information, which is all the information that is encoded and stored in our memory. We can contrast this with accessible information, which is just the information that we're able to retrieve. Okay. So this, okay, so what else I want to say? Oh yeah. So the encoding specificity principle is the idea that when people encode information, they do so in specific ways. And the encoding specificity principle states that to the extent that a retrieval cue matches a memory trace of an experience, it will be effective in evoking the memory. That is, being able to bring the memory to the surface, to be able to retrieve it. So here's an example of this. Let's just say you hear a song on the radio, and that song was played at your high school prom, if you went to your high school prom. That hearing that song on the radio might help you remember all the details of that particular night. Who your date was, the group of friends that you went with, perhaps even very specific information. What you did before, maybe you went out to dinner, what you did after, what you did the next day, what you were all wearing. So the encoding specificity principle says, to the extent that there's a retrieval cue, in this case, the song that you heard on the radio allowed you to retrieve that information. And if it matches the memory trace, okay, because that memory of the prom, the event, is strongly associated with hearing that song at the prom, that song then will be very effective in evoking that memory and all the associated memories that have to do with prom. Remember that because of the idea of consolidation, our memory traces are linked together in an associative network, and that it's not just about bringing up a kind of a single memory, but then you have all the associated memories. All right. So we can measure retrieval in a couple different ways. One way that we can measure retrieval is through the use of production tests. Production tests are really just free recall. Basically, people are asked to remember without using any external cues. And an essay test would be a good example of this. Alternatively, we can test people's retrieval by using recognition tests. A good example of recognition tests would be multiple choice or true-false tests. These generally permit greater memory performance, although it can involve some guesswork as well. But those are ways that we can measure retrieval. All right. So we're going to shift to learning about eyewitness testimony, because there's many important applications of understanding people's memory to understanding whether eyewitnesses should be used or under what circumstances they can be used in the criminal justice system. So what I want you to be able to take away from this part of the lecture is to be able to describe the kinds of mistakes that eyewitnesses commonly make and some of the ways that can hurt the justice system, explain some errors that are common to human memory, and then describe some of the important research that has demonstrated human memory errors and their consequences. Okay, so here's an overview. All right. Eyewitness testimony is what happens when a person witnesses a crime, could be an accident or some other legally important event, and then later has to give a statement to a police officer or a detective, or then even appear at a trial to recall for the court the details of the witnessed event. It sounds very straightforward. You just tell people what you saw, but it turns out it's a very complicated process. It includes encoding what happened at the crime, including who the perpetrator was and what happened, and then it also involves being able to remember. There's also then what happens during the retention interval. So recall that the retention interval is the period of time between when you encode information and then when you're asked to retrieve it. And so there's a lot of things that can happen in between. Okay, from the time that witnesses a crime and then has to give their statement. For instance, before they're interviewed by the police, they may discuss the event with other witnesses. Okay? And in discussing the event with the other witnesses, there can be misinformation that's given, that people might remember different things, and that can create false memories. It's important to understand eyewitness testimony because it's probably the most frequent form of evidence that is presented in court, but in many cases the accuracy should be questioned. There's also evidence that mistaken eyewitness evidence can lead to wrongful conviction. That is, people are sent to prison for years or even decades, even to death row for crimes that they didn't commit. Indeed, faulty eyewitness testimony has been implicated in at least 75% of the DNA exoneration cases. What that means is that 75% of the time, people were later declared innocent because their DNA didn't match. 75% of the time, they had been convicted because of eyewitness testimony. So it's important to understand the fallibility of our memory and our memory processes, and then for our criminal justice system to have systems in place that help eyewitnesses do a better job, or at least to have jurors not rely so much on eyewitness testimony. So let's talk about the process of misinformation, which is really one of the big issues with eyewitness testimony. So I talked about this earlier, but the misinformation effect refers to incorrect information obtained after an event that contaminates our memory of that event. In an early study of eyewitness testimony conducted by Loftus and colleagues, undergraduate subjects first watched a slideshow depicting a small red car driving and then hitting a pedestrian. Some subjects were asked leading questions about what happened to the car in the slides. For example, the subjects were asked, how fast was the car traveling when it passed the yield sign? But the question was actually designed to be misleading because the slide included a stop sign rather than a yield sign. Later, subjects were shown pairs of slides. One of the pair was the original slide containing the stop sign, and the other was the replacement slide containing the yield sign. Subjects were asked which of the pair they had previously seen. Subjects who had been asked about the yield sign were likely to pick the slide showing the yield sign even though they had originally seen the stop sign. In other words, the misinformation in the leading question led to inaccurate memory. This is called the misinformation effect, because the misinformation that subjects were exposed to after the event, here in the form of a misleading question, contaminated subjects' memories of what they had actually witnessed. Hundreds of studies have demonstrated that memory can be contaminated by erroneous information that people are exposed to after they witness an event. The misinformation in these studies has led people to incorrectly remember everything from small but crucial details of a perpetrator's experience to objects as large as a barn that wasn't even there at all. You'll see that there's a link here in your slides. So that's a YouTube video, and that's a demonstration of the misinformation effect. So please check it out. Studies have shown that misinformation can corrupt memory even more easily when it's encountered in social situations. And this is a problem, particularly in cases where more than one person witnesses a crime. So in these cases, witnesses talk to one another in the immediate aftermath of the crime, including as they wait for the police to arrive. Because witnesses are different and they see different things from different perspectives, they're likely to see and notice different things and thus remember different things. And then when they communicate, they not only reinforce common memories of the event, which is good, but they also contaminate each other's memories. Okay, so the module goes on to describe some laboratory evidence which you should be familiar with, but the idea here is there's some irony in that the misinformation effect is more likely to occur in social situations. So you would think it would be a good thing to have multiple eyewitnesses because they all have the ability to see something. And then if they talk to each other, they can reach consensus, and that consensus should be more accurate. But through the process of talking to one another, misinformation can be supplied, and that can actually contaminate each individual eyewitness's memory. Okay, so in terms of eyewitness testimony, what do we know about identifying perpetrators? Well, there's certain factors that are associated with increasing errors. As you might expect, eyewitnesses that have poor vision, trying to view perpetrators under poor viewing conditions, being under stress, so when it's a particularly stressful or dangerous situation, when witnesses don't have a long time to view the crime, and then when there's a long delay between what they're asked to witness and then subsequently remember. And then eyewitnesses are less accurate when they're asked to identify a perpetrator from a race that is different than their own. So law enforcement officials need to be aware that if any of these factors are present, that could lead to unreliability in eyewitness testimony. All right. Now we're going to talk about a couple different kinds of memory biases, and why memory biases happen. So, as described in the module, we have schemas for things, or we have schemata. These refer to a memory template that is created through repeated exposure to a particular class of objects or events. So schemas influence the information people notice, think about, and remember. The idea here is that when we use our schemas, we're more likely to remember things that are consistent with a particular schema. Okay, so when we enter a library, for example, our schema for a library suggests that it should be quiet, that there's books, there's librarians, there might be computers. So in thinking about the types of things that can bias our memory, we know that our schemas make it more likely to recall information that is consistent with a particular schema for a location. And information that would be inconsistent is more likely to be misremembered or forgotten. So in thinking about the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, people are more likely to, if they don't have a good memory for things, to use their schemas to kind of like fill in the gaps. Okay. So using our schemas as memory guides suggests that schemas help people fill in the blanks when they're trying to remember things. We don't remember things exactly as if our minds are cameras. Instead, we remember information that was there, and also remember information that was never there, but we've unknowingly added. Okay. Some other memory biases that we have would be false memories. These would be large memory errors in which events are recalled that never took place. So several research studies have been able to create false memories in subjects, including that they nearly drowned and had to be rescued by lifeguards, spilled punch on a bride's parents at a family wedding, that they had been attacked by a vicious animal as a child. And so what these studies have shown is that our memories are far from perfect, and indeed you can introduce some very large memory errors and very extreme things simply by introducing in people's minds that these things occurred. All right, so overall, when it comes to eyewitness testimony, how can we make things better, or what do we need to know? Eyewitness testimony is very powerful in convincing the jurors, even though it's not particularly reliable. We know that identification of errors occur of perpetrators, and these can lead people to being falsely accused and even convicted. Eyewitness memory can be corrupted by leading questions, conversations with co-witnesses, as well as people's own expectations of what should have occurred based on their schemas. So there's a number of specific recommendations that have been made related to when and how witnesses should be interviewed. Ideally, you want to interview witnesses as soon as you can and keep them away from other witnesses so that they don't contaminate. There's also recommendations for creating lineups of perpetrators and for educating jury members on the fallibility, that is, on the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, and then educating other assessors like judges. So the idea here is that if we can do a better job with interviewing witnesses so that their memory biases don't come into play, but also that if we can educate members of the jury, judges, and lawyers about the fallibility of memory, that will hopefully help the legal system not rely on eyewitness testimony nearly so much.